All right, hey everybody. My name is Nish. We are going to be talking about protests this week. Um, so yeah, let's keep moving. What is protesting? So before we start the presentation, we just wanted to define it. It's a public objection, disapproval, or dissent towards an idea or an action. Now, most of the times when you think of protesting, it's pretty much political. And in the US, the First Amendment is what guarantees the right to protest and freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembly, and the right to petition. And to the right, you have just pictures of, how protests kind of look. We'll get into specific examples later. So yeah.
Okay, so for purpose and goals of a protest, your main potential goals are to influence the public opinion in order to favor whatever you are protesting for. You want to draw attention and share the information about the perceived injustices that are occurring. You want to gain a wide public audience for the cause and also push forward public policy or legislation. There's also learn about more about the issues by either educating oneself or talking to actual witnesses or people that have experienced said injustices. You need to, they're also to connect other people with other people who feel passionate about the issue, speak the truth, and bear witness. And the main purpose of a protest is to demand change. Now, there are several types of protest, but the one that we most commonly see today are nonviolent resistance, which is also called civil disobedience. And this one is characterized by engaging in symbolic protest or peacefully refusing to cooperate. This we have seen many times, especially recently with either Black Lives Matter protests, and the most common ones are the sit-ins that began in the 1960s as a part of the civil rights movements. And as for other historical protests that have occurred, we have child labor laws, which basically were placed restrictions and regulations for the minors to not work. We have the workers' rights, which just established legal and human rights between the workers and the employers. We have voting rights, which ensured the vote in public and political elections, which is also called suffrage, sorry. And then we also have civil rights, which was to protect a person's freedom from infringement by social organizations, private organizations, or the government itself. And then we also find anti-war movements, which were opposed to any government wanting to create any armed conflict with other countries. And last but not least, we had school segregations, which was the process of ending race-based segregation in public and private schools.
Okay, so there are many important long-term enabling factors that go into global protests and considering the complexities of global protests, for which I just want to go into a little bit more detail about. So the first one would be kind of the increase in communication globally. The sweep of change in communication technologies facilitates protests in many ways. Not only does it make information more available to many people, giving them greater awareness of how others are asserting themselves against entrenched power in other countries, but it allows the creation of channels of communication among citizens, making protests more easily or easier to organize, I guess. Another really important thing that goes into enabling factors would be global economic trends. So considerable economic growth in many parts of developing worlds has brought with it the rise of a new middle class, which enables them to develop resources that gives them new perspectives and capabilities. And in the same vein, economic stagnation and sudden downturns in places has also contributed to the rise of protests. For the third one, we have the larger cycle of democracy's global advancement. Waves of protests have contributed to the onset of attempted democratic transitions in many countries. And then for the fourth one, we have civil society organizations. So there's been a tremendous growth of civil society organizations around the globe, which is not just attributed to NGOs, but broad long-term organizational development of civil society in many developing countries has contributed to this new protest wave as well. So when we consider the results of protests, there are some interesting ideas that analysts have put forth, kind of attributing protests to two major categories. So the first one being protests constitute an unfolding wave of disruptive, basically pro-democratic change that signals trouble for many non-democratic governments. And the second one being protests are providing effective or proving effective leaders and tearing governments down, not at building new institutions, political processes, or at devising positive solutions to problems. And obviously, we need to be very wary of these ideas that are being put forth by the analysts or general propositions that are advanced by some analysts that contemporary protests are all about tearing down structures of power, but not actually achieving any sustained political change. People need to be cautious that in accepting any definitive conclusion, either that protests are reshaping the modern world or in contrast that they're not doing anything at all. Obviously, protests have been and are becoming more and more important in today's world, and their complexity and diversity is a much more telling characteristic of them, as opposed to just one overarching character or set of effects.
So one of the tools involved in these areas is social media, and I think we've seen a lot of that through, and I'm going to talk about TikTok because it existed before this year, before 2020, and I think it played a really important role in terms of education and organization this past summer, especially in the Black Lives Movement context, and also brings up a point of censorship in protests. So there were some issues where TikTok users accused the app where the hashtags of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter had no views. The company defended itself, saying that it was a technical issue, but it has had run-ins in censorship, like Isabel mentioned, with like voting and democracy. It has disabled, suppressed other makers and hiding videos of the protests in Hong Kong. Of note, TikTok is banned in several countries, most notably India, because of the farmers' protests going on there. We'll talk about that later, I think. But I want to bring up this point. I think this goes beyond TikTok, is that what role do private companies have in realms? And what is censorship versus free speech versus limiting speech? And we'll have breakout rooms later for you to discuss that. And also, we talked about earlier the history of protests. In what sense and what role, what category are social media playing in protests? Are they strictly sit-ins now, or most of these things happening online? And has social media sped up the rate at which the processes occur, which I think we'll talk about in the next slide. So I'll let keep moving.
All right, I'm going to talk about the general idea of success in protests and some factors that may help improve it. So the general goal or end game for most protests and social movements is for some kind of long-standing change to be implemented. This often takes the form of things like new legislation being passed, company policy being permanently changed to meet demands, or a new precedence through court cases. Unfortunately, the change needed by protests takes time to finally come into effect. Usually the desired changes occur gradually, and this is for a couple of reasons. The movement for the protest needs to attract attention or awareness, and public opinion may also need to be swayed, which might take a while. Additionally, actual changes need to be implemented in the big institutions for permanent effects. New precedent might need to be set through court cases, and some movements might require negotiation with the government or company. And it's also important to note that not all protests can take the same amount of time to get their desired success. For example, the civil rights movement took 20 years to obtain success, but some movements like the women's suffrage movement took almost a century. And even in the modern era, with more easier to access to or organization, they also take an annoying amount of time to be successful, like the climate movement. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some actions that influence success in protests and social movements. In short, the more organized or defined a social movement or protest is, the more successful it can be. Having clear and defined goals and demands and addressing specific injustices can help make information in protests easier to understand. Persuading neutral observers to take action and mobilizing other allies helps spread your message. Getting the attention and support of institutions helps implement beneficial policy, and avoiding violence or protesting also helps obtain public support. While this talk about success, it's important to talk about the so-called unsuccessful protests. Even though demands may not have been met, such such as for the Hong Kong protests, there's still hope. Just the act of protesting can catalyze change in the future by garnering support in the present. And more importantly, it can push other people to protest for other important causes.
So understanding the increase in the protest wave is obviously essential for policymakers and political observers. Yet it seems like there is a lack of general understanding, and in some cases, active misunderstanding that is apparent in some Western media and analytical accounts of protest events. Although protests do seem to resemble one another in certain basic ways, it seems that this encourages simplistic analogies across various different contexts. Observers tend to focus on few of the most striking protests and then draw general conclusions that then are applied rather too sweepingly to the overall body of events. It's necessary when considering these things to take a step back to look at the overall landscape of protests and consider their many different diversities and complexities. While there is some conventional wisdom that isn't entirely incorrect regarding protests, many of the most common ideas are applied a little bit too generally. There are many important local triggers to consider when considering the complexities of global protests. We can't just attribute it to the increase in the nature of global communication. Some drivers are primarily political, whether it be a rigged election or maybe an unconstitutional extension of a president's term in office. Some are primarily socioeconomic, whether it is a specific event or something more systemic like sharp economic decline or rising inequality. And there are also many in-between triggers that are related to governance issues and can combine political and economic elements, for example, like corruption. Protests have also flared in many countries that involve a high rate of economic growth. So whether there are multiple drivers that are often present within outbreaks and protests, and pinning down exactly what the near-term and long-term causes of any major protest event is pretty difficult.
So now we'll look at a example of unity through protest. So how protests can bring people together, actually. So this is something that's going on right now in India, and it's quite a big issue. A lot of celebrities have even spoken about it. It's a pretty big deal. So the problem that's happening right now is that farmers are protesting because the government is enacted bills that will make things more difficult for them and can reduce possibly their profits. The way that works is normally farmers sell their produce to something called a market, which is basically a market yard regulated by the government, who then sell it to other shops, grocery stores, other small vendors, etc. So that's regulated by the government, meaning that they pay a standard price for it, which is called the minimum selling price. However, that's not actually enacted into the law. It's just something that the government does currently. With the 3 laws, they would remove that, and the price of produce now becomes subject to market forces. So in certain areas, that's a good thing, certain areas, it's a bad thing. So you never know, depending on the supply of that particular produce. And there's a possibility, since farmers are largely uneducated, that large corporations will exploit these farmers, and because they will be unable to form any kind of agreement with them, and the large corporations could kind of join together and exploit the farmers. So that is a pretty big issue. So right now the farmers are protesting because they want the minimum selling price to be made their legal right. Even more so, the laws have the potential to increase the price of food, which can be detrimental for a country like India. So not only farmers are protesting, but people who are already unable to afford food are protesting too. And something that's interesting about this protest is that not only the poor farmers, but the rich farmers who don't stand to lose a lot are protesting with them too, which is really interesting. And support for this movement even transcends religion, caste, income divide, and even their support from rivaling factions, which are the laborers and the farmers, due to a complicated reason, but in short, it's mostly due to caste and labor issues. but they both have also joined hands and they've also come to a lot of consensus about things because of this protest, that workers have agreed to a lot of the farmers' conditions and the farmers have agreed to some of the workers' conditions. So there's a lot of unity basically, and you can see that there's a huge number of people protesting at once. So that's what's really amazing about this protest. It's the ability to bring people together against a common enemy, which is in this case the government.
All right, so that's just a quick breakdown on our take on some of the aspects of protesting. So we're now going to split out into breakout rooms. Each room is going to be assigned a particular protest to be talking about. I've dropped the breakout room notes document in the chat. If you scroll down to the bottom of that document, there will be links to articles for you to read. That's just to sort of get you started. As you're going through the questions in there, I encourage you to do your own research, talk to the people in your rooms, try and learn as much about this protest as you can, some of the reasons why it happened, what some of the effects were. When we come back into our main room, we'll be asking each group to share. So please make sure that you assign someone in your group to be responsible for sharing back, or find some way to divide up the responsibility between you. Yeah, I think that's everything. Again, I would just like to highlight a norm that we mentioned earlier. You have permission to be raggedy. When we're talking about some of these issues, they can be very complicated. They can be very politically charged. We're all here to learn, and we're here to help each other learn as well. So feel free to ask questions. Feel free to provide thoughts that aren't quite fully formed. No one's going to be calling you out here. We're instead going to call you in. So yeah, I think with that, Shaylin, if the breakout rooms are ready.
Yep, just make sure that you have opened your notes document so you have that pulled